Mark's breath clouded in the cold night air, the forest around him dead quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch beneath his boots. He shifted the black tarp over his shoulder, the dead body inside slipping slightly. The woods were perfect for this, no trails, no hikers, just endless trees and darkness. "Goddamn heavy bastard," Mark muttered. Greg had always been an asshole, but Mark hadn't planned on killing him. One too many drinks and an argument about debts, and now Greg was lying dead in a tarp, his skull caved in from a wrench. Now, Mark was deep in the woods, trying to disappear the evidence. He found a clearing, dumping the body onto the dirt with a heavy thud. Mark stood there, wiping the sweat off his brow despite the cold. The plan was simple: dig a shallow grave, dump Greg, and get the hell out. The shovel hit the ground with a dull thud as Mark started digging. It was slow, exhausting work, but after an hour, the hole was deep enough. He rolled Greg's lifeless body into it, the tarp dragging through the dirt. Mark shoveled the dirt back in hastily, barely covering him before he heard a noise. A rustling came from the trees behind him. Mark froze. Something was moving out there. He turned, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. "Who's there?" His voice was rough, more of a growl than a question. No answer, just more rustling. And then, the trees parted, and it stepped into the clearing. At first, he thought it was an animal. But no animal moved like that. Its limbs were too long, skin pale and stretched over bone, its eyes hollow black pits. It stared at him, motionless, except for its heavy, ragged breath. Mark's blood ran cold. The thing, the rake, stood there, watching him. He'd heard stories about it, legends about some creature in the woods, but he never believed that shit. Now, here it was, tall, twisted, and all too real. "Fuck me," Mark whispered, stumbling back, his heart pounding in his ears. The rake moved fast, faster than anything that size should have been able to. 1 second, it was just standing there. The next, it was inches from Mark's face. He swung the shovel, connecting with its arm with a sickening crack. The rake hissed, pulling back, its eyes narrowing. Without thinking, Mark bolted, running through the woods, his lungs burning as he sprinted through the trees. He could hear it behind him, the snapping of branches as it chased him. He didn't dare look back. By the time he reached his truck, he was shaking so hard he could barely turn the key in the ignition. He slammed the door, the engine roaring to life as he sped down the dirt road. His heart raced, and his mind screamed for him to get away. Somehow, he made it home alive. The next morning, Mark woke up with the memory gnawing at him. Had it really been real? Or had the guilt of killing Greg and too much whiskey gotten to his head? There was one way to know for sure. By noon, he was back at the clearing. The grave was disturbed, dirt scattered everywhere. Mark's heart pounded as he stepped closer. The tarp was ripped apart. The body, gone. Bits of Greg's flesh clung to the torn plastic, bones left behind with deep bite marks. Mark crouched down, staring at the mess. "Holy shit," he breathed. The rake had eaten him. Cleaned up the mess. Mark looked around the clearing, his mind racing. A creature that disposed of bodies for him. This was something he could use. A week later, he tested the theory. Another body, an old friend who'd been asking too many questions, ended up in the same clearing. Mark dumped the corpse, left the scene, and came back the next day. Just like before, the body was gone, torn apart and consumed. It worked. Mark grinned. He was free. No more cleanup, no more worrying about evidence. The rake would handle it all. No matter how many he killed, no one would ever find the bodies. By now, Mark was killing regularly, picking his victims more carefully. No one that would be missed, at first. Drifters, junkies, people who wouldn't leave a mark on the world. He'd leave them in the clearing, and by morning, they were gone, consumed by the creature in the woods. The power was intoxicating. He could get rid of anyone he wanted. The cops didn't stand a chance. There were no bodies, no evidence. Just bloodstains in the dirt, quickly covered by the forest. But the more Mark killed, the sloppier he got. He didn't care about who he targeted anymore. His need to kill outweighed the risks. One night, after a particularly brutal kill, Mark stood in the clearing, looking at the latest victim at his feet. The thrill of the kill still buzzed in his veins. "You hungry, buddy?" Mark called into the dark, his voice echoing in the trees. He heard the familiar rustling. The rake was nearby, waiting, just like always. The pale creature appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching him from the shadows. Mark laughed, flicking a cigarette into the dirt. "Another one for you. Better get it while it's fresh." But this time, the rake didn't move toward the body. It moved toward him. Mark barely had time to react before it lunged. Its bony claws slashed through his jacket, sinking into his flesh with a sickening rip. He screamed, stumbling back, but it was too late. The Rake's hollow eyes were fixed on him now, its jagged mouth hanging open as it dragged him into the dirt. Mark kicked and thrashed, trying to fight it off, but the creature was too strong. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed in was the Rake's long teeth sinking into his shoulder, its breath hot and foul against his skin. The clearing was silent once again. The only evidence left was a mangled corpse and the satisfied rake, fading back into the woods, its hunger momentarily sated.